In this discussion, we have just one theme, and that is the theme of power. And it really is an extraordinary transition that the United States experiences between late 1941 and late 1945. Before the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, many Americans do not want to get involved in the Second World War. I think by that time there's a sense of inevitability that the United States will get involved in the Second World War. But many Americans don't want to. But of course the United States does get into this global conflict. And by the late summer of 1945, the United States is this dominant power in the world. And it remains a dominant power well into the 21st century. Around the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, a high-ranking Japanese official said that the United States had been awakened, that a giant had been awakened. And certainly that's true. And so as we look at these images, we see not only young men at work in this war, but we also see symbols of this awakened national presence, this awakened national power. And this becomes quite clear as the years after the Second World War unfold. We see the map on the left, in the top left, and in red there, that's the German Empire. The Nazi regime builds this empire very, very rapidly from 1939 into the early 1940s. But then we look at the map on the right, and we see that this empire is being rolled back. The Russians are pushing in a westward direction from Russia. The other allies are pushing from an eastward direction. The British, the French, the Americans, and the German Empire is going out of business. The Nazi Empire is going out of business. Another symbol of American power is what's called the Lend-Lease program. During the war, the United States makes resources available to other allies. And you see the map on the bottom left there. And here we have goods and resources from the United States going to the Soviet Union. Of course, before the Second World War, the United States and the Soviet Union did not get along very well. The Soviet Union is a communist power. The United States is a capitalist, democratic power. These two powers did not have much in common. But fighting the Germans, and then at the very end of the war, the Russians, the Soviets come into the war against the Japanese. The United States and the Soviet Union during World War II have a common enemy. And there's a famous phrase that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so during the war, the Soviet Union and the United States will become friends of a sort. And the United States will provide the Soviet Union with many of the resources it uses to prosecute its war against the Nazis especially, and then at the very end of the war against the Japanese. And we see the photo on the bottom right there where American and Russian soldiers are meeting. And we can see in the map on the top right how the Soviet and the American soldiers converge on Germany. And so these two powers, the Soviet Union and the United States, are the dominant powers after the Second World War. And the world gets split up into three general categories. In the blue there we have what we could call the free world, or sometimes called the first world. And so we see the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Western Europe, the Scandinavian countries, Canada. And then there is the communist world, and there we see the Soviet Union and China, North Korea, for example. And then there was what was called the third world. And these days we think of the third world as basically poor countries around the world. But in the context of the Cold War, the third world is a reference to countries that are not specifically aligned either with the United States as a leading power or with the Soviet Union or China as leading communist powers. Now, many of these countries in what was then called the third world leaned in one or another direction. But the idea is that they're not specifically aligned with either. So we have these two dominant powers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Let's look at some of the ways the United States becomes a dominant global power. So we have the quote, At the Bretton Woods Conference in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944, so notice that World War II hasn't ended yet, it ends in August 45, the Western Allies established the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, and we still hear this referred to often in the news, to encourage world trade by regulating currency exchange rates. They also founded the International Bank of Reconstruction and Development, better known as the World Bank, to promote economic growth in war-ravaged and underdeveloped areas. Now, one of the things to notice is that these two international institutions, which we still hear about, the IMF, the World Bank, these are formed at a meeting held in the United States, that is, in New Hampshire. By 1944, there are other places we could meet, and I suppose one of the reasons we meet in New Hampshire is that the war is not being fought anywhere close to here. But it's not that the United States is the only place they could have met. And so I think it's significant that they're meeting in the United States, that these important global institutions are being created at a meeting in the United States. 3 years later, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, another institution often heard about in the news, reduced trade barriers among member nations. And here we get to a key point. In contrast to the experience after World War I, the United States took the lead in creating these important international bodies and supplied most of their funding. So unlike after the First World War, when there was a strong feeling in the United States that, maybe we shouldn't have got into that war, and we don't want to be involved in an international organization like the League of Nations. Unlike that, at the end of the Second World War, there's a general sense that the United States not only needs to be involved, but it needs to be a leading power. Among non-communist countries, the leading power. And then it says that the United States supplies most of the funding for these organizations. What's curious is just 5 or 6 years before, the country was in economic depression with unemployment rates of 15, 16, 17, 18%. Just 6 years later, now the United States is funding the creation of these international bodies. Something really dramatic has happened inside the United States, and this now has global implications. The quote says that America was uniquely positioned to shape the world order after World War II. Part of that has to do with the fact that the war is not fought on American soil. There is, of course, the small Alaskan island of Attu. We can think of Hawaii being attacked as American soil. The Philippines had been part of the American Empire. The Japanese invade and occupy. That's not quite American soil. Certainly the American mainland has been free of war. So that's one reason the United States is uniquely positioned to shape the world order, but also because of its incredible wealth and its incredible military power, which is an expression of that wealth. Let's look at this quote. In contrast to the chilly reception of the League of Nations in 1919, that is after the First World War, the Senate overwhelmingly approved the United Nations Charter on July 28, 1945. So whereas the U.S. Senate rejected entry into the League of Nations in 1919 after the First World War, now the United States will join the successor institution. And not only will the United States join it, and you see the vote, they're 89-2 in the U.S. Senate, but the United States set up its permanent glass home in New York City. That is, in the United States, and that remains true in the 21st century, that the United Nations is housed in New York City. So there's another indication of what's happening. Not only does the United States now join the UN, the United States actually has taken the lead in helping to create the UN. We see the photo there of President Roosevelt on the left, Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Britain, on the right, and they meet even before the United States gets into the Second World War, and they agree to what's called the Atlantic Charter. And one of the ideas of the Atlantic Charter is that some successor to the League of Nations needs to be formed. If the basic goal of the League of Nations was to prevent another global war, well, clearly it failed. We need to try again. The American president plays a key role in forming the United Nations, and now the United Nations will be housed in the United States, another symbol of the power that the country has acquired as a result of its involvement in this war. Another symbol of American power, and this is related to what's called the Berlin Airlift. And it's a complicated story, but after the Second World War, Germany is divided. The eastern half of Germany is occupied by the Soviets. The western half of Germany is occupied by the United States, British powers, and French powers. And Berlin itself is also divided. Eastern Berlin occupied by the Soviets, Western Berlin occupied by the United States, France, and Britain. The Soviets want all of Berlin within its sphere, and so they try to basically choke Western Berlin into submission, and they stop all roads from Western Germany into Western Berlin. And so the question is, will the Soviets be able to take all of Berlin? Well, the United States and its allies do not want this to happen. Who can prevent it? There's only one answer to that question. Only the United States has the power to prevent Western Berlin from coming under the control of the Soviets. How will it do it? Well, the Soviets have blocked the roads, and so we can't drive goods in to feed the Western Berliners. And so what are we going to do? President Truman says we're going to fly goods around the clock from Western Germany into Western Berlin. And this is what happens for basically a year. And it's not only Americans who are involved. Britons, Canadians, others are involved, but the United States takes the lead. And so let's look at the quote. For nearly a year, American pilots ferried thousands of tons of supplies a day to the grateful West Berliners. Western Europeans took heart from this vivid demonstration of America's determination to honor its commitments in Europe. Notice that language. The United States now has commitments in Europe. Well, this is exactly why America First said we don't want to get into this war, because we don't want to have these foreign entanglements. This is what America First is saying, and they're quoting George Washington. But we come out of the Second World War, well, there's no question about it. The United States is entangled in the world's affairs. It has commitments to the security of Western Europe. It has commitments to the security of Western Berlin. And so this is a risky move. We're going to fly goods into West Berlin. And understanding that the Soviets could shoot one of these planes down. And there's talk at the time about a potential war between the United States and the Soviet Union. But if Western Berlin is going to stay outside of the Soviet orbit, who has the power to see to that? Only the United States. It has allies, yes, but the United States has to take the lead. It's another symbol of American power. Another symbol of American power is the Truman Doctrine. So remember, near the end of the Second World War, President Roosevelt dies, his vice president, Harry Truman, takes over, and so Truman is still president in 1947. In an appearance, President Truman went before Congress on March 12, 1947, and requested support for what came to be known as the Truman Doctrine. Specifically, he asked for $400 million to bolster Greece and Turkey, that is, against communist aggression. There's the concern that Greece might become communist. There's the concern that Turkey might become communist. There's concern that other countries might become communist. Well, who has the power to help Greece not become communist? Who has the power to help Turkey, France, other countries not to become communist? It's really the United States that's going to have to take the lead. So President Truman asked for $400 million to bolster Greece and Turkey. He declared that it must be, and here's a key quote, it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. Now, it's understood that when President Truman refers to attempted subjugation, he means by communist forces. And it is the policy of the United States to support free peoples. Will the United States have allies in this effort? Yes, but the United States is going to take the lead. The writers go on to say that this is a sweeping and open-ended commitment, because we can look back now and see that this commitment plays an important role in getting the United States involved in Vietnam, for example. But notice once again, the president is saying the United States is taking to itself a commitment to a global mission to try to stop the spread of communism. The Truman administration decided to join the European pact called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This was in 1949. So remember, before the U.S. gets into the Second World War, the America First Committee, isolationists are saying, we don't want to get involved in this war. We don't want foreign entanglements. Well, we get through the war, and now the United States certainly is entangled in the world's affairs. It's in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's in the United Nations. It's in these other institutions that we've referred to. Not only is the United States in these organizations, it is leading these organizations. And so we come to the first major conflict after the Second World War, a conflict in Korea. Without consulting Congress, President Truman ordered American air and naval units to support South Korea. What happens is, in the summer of 1950, Korean forces in the north, North Korean forces, which are communist, invade South Korea with the goal of making all of Korea communist. Just as Germany is divided after the Second World War, so Korea is divided after the Second World War. Communist North, non-communist South. In the summer of 1950, the communist forces in the North invade with the intention of taking over the whole country. Well, we don't want communism to spread. We don't want all of Korea to become communist. But who can stop it? There's only one answer to that question: the United States. And so President Truman also ordered General Douglas MacArthur's Japanese-based occupation troops into action alongside the beleaguered South Koreans, and so began the ill-fated Korean War. Now, it says the Korean War was ill-fated, and I'm not exactly sure what the writer is getting at. What we can say is that today, South Korea is a vibrant, prosperous democracy. North Korea is one of the poorest countries in the world. And so, if the Korean War was ill-fated in the short term, certainly that's not the case for South Korea in the long term. South Korea is free and prosperous today, primarily because of the work of the United States. As it says there, the South Koreans were beleaguered. If the war were left just to them, they almost certainly would have lost. Now, the United States has many allies in this conflict. This is actually a United Nations war. And so the United States has many allies, but the United States is the overwhelming power that prevents South Korea from becoming communist. Officially, the United States was simply participating in a United Nations police action. That was the term used at the time. Congress never officially declares war. And so technically, according to the U.S. Constitution, it's not a war because Congress never actually declared war. It's a United Nations police action. But the United States provided 88% of the United Nations contingents. And so it's another symbol of American power. If we don't want South Korea to become communist, well then who has the power to stop it? There's only one answer: the United States. With many allies, but the United States takes the lead. And as we look at South Korea in the early 21st century and see a prosperous and democratic society, and we ask the question, who made that possible? And the primary answer is the United States. Of course, the South Koreans have done a tremendous amount themselves, but who made it possible for the South Koreans to have that opportunity? As a historical matter, we have to say that was the work primarily of the United States. And so after the Second World War, the United States has great power. It is one of two dominant powers in the world. We fast forward several decades, and by the time we get to 1991, the Soviet Union has ceased to exist. And so then the United States becomes the sole world power, with a military presence around the world. And you see the military bases that the U.S. has around the world, a global presence around the world, Navy ships, aircraft carriers, air bases. There's no question that from the end of the Second World War in 1945 well into the 21st century, the United States was a great power in the world, not only militarily, economically, but also in terms of providing assistance and aid to so many countries around the world that needed help. The United States certainly is one of the great historical powers in human history.